and welcome to our second lecture on group stages. To follow our lecture on forming, in this lecture we're looking at the next two group stages, storming and norming, as part of our group skills in substance abuse counseling course. As we look at the objectives for the week, I want to remind you to review the chapters for the week prior to viewing the lecture, as it is intended to supplement your reading. By the end of the week, you should be able to identify behavior that may be considered resistance during the storming stage, describe how peer relationships develop in the norming stage, and distinguish among the first stages of groups, including forming, storming, and norming. First, let's review the 5 stages of group development that we're looking at during these 3 weeks. The stages include the initial stage of forming, which we discussed last week, and is characterized by initial caution associated with any new experience. During the forming stage, members may attempt to avoid being rejected by others, and may be superficial, centering conversations on historical or future events that don't necessarily have a direct impact on the group experience. With respect to tasks during the forming stage, remember that the group must deal with apprehension, as well as review member goals and contracts, specify rules, set limits, and promote positive interchange among members. This week we're going to talk about the next 2 stages, storming and norming. And then next week we'll wrap up by talking about the working and closing stages, also known as performing and adjoining. So first today we will look at the storming stage and talk a little bit about member behavior here. As the group transitions from the initial forming stage to the next stage, which is storming, group members may begin to compete with one another to find their place in the group. Peer relationships may be uncomfortable as the group struggles over power and control, and may be characterized by anxiety, resistance, defensiveness, conflict, and confrontation. The storming stage helps bridge the group closer to a time of productivity, and although it may be uncomfortable, it is necessary in the development of a successful group. Primary tension is what members are likely to experience during the first session, and primary tension is concerned with the kind of awkwardness that comes with strange situations. Secondary tension, in contrast, deals with intra-group conflict and is what we see in the storming stage. With the help of group leaders, members work through non-productive ways of relating and begin to establish new patterns and a role in the group. The issue of power is central to the storming stage and refers to the capacity to bring about certain intended consequences in the behavior of others. In response to the struggle for power, group members may at first attempt to address the issue through old approaches, like fighting or withdrawing. And because members are still just beginning to get to know one another, there's very little trust established in the group during the storming stage. Members may exhibit resistance to change through behaviors like intellectualizing, questioning, or advice giving, as well as band-aiding, where members prevent others from expressing their emotional pain by trying to soothe a calm member who may actually benefit from exploring themselves more deeply. Other resistant behavior may be seen through dependency, or members who monopolize group time, and also through an attack on the group leader, which may come as a result of subgrouping, fear of intimacy, or extra-group socializing. There are many strategies for working through the interpersonal and intrapersonal group issues that occur during the storming stage, which may include inviting a process observer to come provide feedback on what he or she sees occurring within the group. This neutral third party can help spark conversations, which might allow members to attempt to change behaviors or modify ways of interacting. Working through the storming stage will result in members having a greater capacity for productive work by having established emotional space for one another. The interdependency among group members and the stability of the group as a whole cannot deepen until issues within the group surface, are acknowledged, and are dealt with. The work that occurs during the storming stage allows for the group to progress to the norming stage, and ultimately this is the work that allows for productivity and success in the long term. As we move into the norming stage, Group norming refers to the we-ness that describes group identity or cohesiveness that's now possible once the group has resolved the storming stage. During this stage, peer relationships are categorized by an increased sense of identification, where members begin to see themselves as being similar to one another. Members are also more likely to work harmoniously with each other, displaying high levels of cooperation and collaboration during the stage. Cohesion describes a sense of groupness that promotes high morale, trust, and solidarity. Cohesive groups are more effective in their communication patterns and also tend to have more fun, but there can also be pitfalls. For instance, a group that's highly cohesive may avoid addressing anything that could potentially be upsetting in an attempt to maintain that positive atmosphere. But ultimately, this detracts from the overall success of the group and its members. With respect to tasks, during the norming stage, group members learn to regulate, evaluate, and coordinate their efforts. They do so by showing support, empathizing, facilitating discussion, and providing self-disclosures which reveal information about themselves to other group members. The norming stage results in a group that feels connected and is able to move on to concentrate on being productive rather than protecting themselves. Norming allows group members to clear their minds, reassess their goals, feel good about themselves, and make new plans for the working stage of the group. So here we are again, ready for our second video clip, looking at leading in the here and now. This 1 hour section is called Transition and Flight. And you will again need to log in using your username and password in order to access the video. This video is going to illustrate these next two stages for us of storming and norming, and also provides a nice model for strong group leadership. Please make sure to take the time to review this video, whether it be in short segments or the full hour in one sitting, and look specifically for issues related to struggles for power, issues of anxiety, and later an increased sense of identification and cooperation and collaboration among group members. This final slide compares each of the three stages that we've discussed through these lectures. I encourage you to review the information carefully and make sure that you can distinguish among the three stages thus far. Remember that forming is characterized by initial caution associated with any new experience and an attempt to avoid being rejected by others. During this stage, group members try to be superficial and center conversation around historical or events that do not have a direct impact on the group. During this stage, members must deal with apprehension, review member goals and contracts, specify rules, set limits, and promote a positive interchange among members. We've seen that the storming stage is characterized by a time of conflict and anxiety. During this stage, the group moves from the primary tension that comes with the awkwardness around any new experience to now secondary tension, which has to relationships within the group. During the storming stage, there's an attempt to balance between too much and too little tension, as we talked about with cohesion. And group members tend to be more anxious in their interactions, and power is a main concern here. During the norming stage, there is a strong sense of we-ness that comes when individuals feel a sense of belonging. High levels of enthusiasm and cooperation are also during the stage. Group members begin to identify with one another, and the relationships may benefit from hope, cooperation, collaboration, and cohesion. During the norming stage, group members agree on norms, accept prescriptive and proscriptive norms, and there's a heavy emphasis on commitment. This serves to conclude our lecture on storming and norming through this review of all three stages thus far.
Hey, everybody. So we've got a lot of the chances at running a group: forming, storming, norming, and performing. And then some of the work with Dr. Kaplan. A lot of you want to work with teens and college students, like I did when I was your age. You want somebody who's younger than you. So this is some of what he says to do.
Braden, as
Dr. Kaplan has suggested, and very helpful. So if you have any questions, email.
All right, so we're going to get started, and we're going to talk today a little bit about providing therapy for children, adolescents, and how to apply this to the school system. The vast majority of it will be related to K to 12, but I did have a slide on the counseling center. So we're going to talk about children, adolescents, and the school process. So this will be one of our special populations talks, right? So without further ado, let me share my screen if it'll let me. All right, so our first learning objective is to describe the various types of groups and considerations that affect running groups or conducting groups in school settings. We'll discuss things like recruiting, screening, selecting participants. We'll talk about various guidelines and best practices when running groups with children and adolescents. We'll talk a little bit about the various therapeutic factors linked to play therapy and how it's applied to children and adolescents. We'll talk about developmental themes in adolescence. Most of it will be grounded in Ericksonian work and the concept of the identity crisis and how that affects teenagers. Then we'll discuss the various challenges you might experience when running groups with adolescents, guidelines for helping adolescents deal with anger and conflict, which is fairly common in adolescence. We'll talk briefly about structure of groups in counseling centers and schools. So this lecture provides a general format. It can be applied in many different ways. The first two are very concrete and clear cut. So discussing how to apply groups to children and adolescents, that's pretty clear cut. The application to counseling centers and university centers, that's fairly clear cut. It'll be covered. But these principles can be applied to private practices or community mental health centers, whether they be public or private. So in general, when we run a group, we put an emphasis on prevention and intervention. When we talk about prevention, what we're really talking about here is primary prevention. And if you've taken a psychopathology course, you've probably heard of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Well, primary prevention is to address an issue before it occurs. It's an issue that you can anticipate, and you address it before it becomes a problem. Whereas secondary and tertiary prevention are more or less intervention strategies once the problem has emerged. So the intervention, an intervention can happen in an early stage of development. So you can address drugs and alcohol in a group setting before kids are using drugs, or when they first start using drugs, or after they've developed a substance use disorder and it's interfered with their life. So tertiary prevention is after it's become a significant problem. Now, when we run groups, we want to target before it occurs or along that pathway, early stages or later stage, in a way to promote student development, healthy functioning, and help them navigate their activities of daily living. What we find is that smaller groups are incredibly important when working in school settings. And I know I've talked to you about 8 to 12 being the range of acceptability for groups, but when it comes to school, especially in early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence, you might consider 6 to 8, which is smaller than a traditional group, but that also gives each person more space to participate. So we see research suggests that smaller groups are better. We also want to make sure that the groups are doing what they're supposed to, which is to help develop as a full functioning person. And that includes their physical domain, their cognitive domain, and their socio-emotional domain. So you want to make sure that it helps the full person. Now, I'll give you an example where we've seen a lot of research. When working with children on the autism spectrum, if a child is not in a mainstream setting or classroom, it's not uncommon for them to have a 6-to-1 ratio. That's 6 kids to 1 teacher, right? Or an 8-to-1 ratio. And you might ask yourself, well, why not the 25 kids that are in a standard classroom? Well, it's the same principle. Smaller groups results in more individualized attention, and that results in better outcomes. So that's important. Now, group settings or group therapy in school settings, better yet, tend to be brief, highly structured, whether it be through a psychoeducational or cognitive behavioral orientation. They tend to be very problem and solution focused. So you might remember earlier in this semester, I talked about solution focused brief therapy, right? The group itself tends to be more homogeneous. So the more similarity helps the therapeutic alliance, especially if you're going to have a few sessions. So the shorter the duration of the group, the more important it is to have a homogeneous membership. I already said that the orientations tend to be CBT or psychoeducational. Now, when it comes to dealing with more severe mental illness or severe problems, that usually is not going to happen in a group therapy setting for schools. It's not the setting for that. It's not uncommon if you have severe and persistent mental illness that you're trying to address. So things like schizophrenia or whatnot, you're not going to do that in a school setting. You're going to refer them out to either an outpatient clinic or an inpatient hospital, depending on how regressed they are at that point. So understanding the level of care that you can provide is going to be important, right? Because school counselors, you're focusing on schoolwork, friendships, bullying, things like that. But severe mental illness, you're not going to be able to do in a school setting. So you need to know when it's time to refer out. or when it's time to refer to a higher level of care. And when I say higher level of care, it's because that individual needs more attention, or the issue is more severe than you can provide an intervention for in a school setting. So referrals, like I said, can be an outpatient clinic for weekly therapy. It could be an inpatient hospitalization in the cases of schizophrenia or suicidal intent and plan. It could be a social services agency if there's some issue related to their home life. So you need to know when to do a referral, and you need to make it part of your practice to have a list of referral resources for each of these domains. I have, for my independent practice, a community mental health agency in all 5 boroughs. I have a recommended psychiatrist for all 5 boroughs. I have inpatient hospitals that I recommend to in all 5 boroughs. I have social services contact for all 5 boroughs that I have just in case I need to refer out. So when you're building your practice, however you're doing it, you need to have these resource sheets to make sure that if they need higher level of care, you do that. All right. So developing the proposal, you want to make sure that your goals and purposes are expressed clearly. Now here's the deal. This proposal is oftentimes in a school setting going to be reviewed by the principal and or the assistant principal, as well as the guidance counselor. And I know I'm going to say this later, but you want to make sure you have the blessing of the administration for whatever proposal you're going to do. Because if something goes down, if something goes wrong, and you didn't show them your proposal, then you're leaving yourself on the hook. So make sure that the proposal is written well, the goal and the purposes are clearly explained. Make sure that you get the blessing of the administration. Make sure that the rationale, the need for the group is clear. Make sure how the children are going to benefit, or the adolescents are going to benefit from participating, is clear. And as with all groups, you want to make sure your targeted interventions, procedures, and evaluations are clearly listed. Now, I've said this before, very little of this is new, except for the fact that you want to get the blessing of other people. And this is a good example why you would write a proposal, not just for my class, but in agency work, in school work, school-based settings, you're going to need another person's approval. So you also want to demonstrate that whatever stated gains they're going to get are accomplished. So you want to make sure that you can assess your outcomes using an evaluation and your documentation is on point. So as with all other groups, you have collective goals and individualized goals. If we were to think about today's session that we did, we have an overarching goal of the session was to address various aspects of stress and allow you to pick where you wanted to go. And we picked school-based stress to focus on, but notice how even though collectively we're all focused on school-based stress, each of you were assigned unique homework. You're gonna come back next week and report what you did and the effect it had on your mood. And if we were writing a session note, we would chart that next week for your personal file. Now, just to give you an idea, my memory isn't perfect, so I took notes, right? I took notes, very brief notes, as to what you said and how it fit into the group. So when you work towards your individual goals, we need to be able to document progress. You also need to develop an attendance policy. Similar to other groups, it's important, but here, because this is happening in a school setting, you might be pulling a person out of another class in order to run this group. It's not uncommon for this to happen. The period that's most common to pull someone out is their lunch period, or if they had a free period, that one, so that it doesn't interfere with their academic curriculum. But what happens if someone has a test and they can't come? You want to develop a student-friendly attendance policy. You also want to address when a person just doesn't show up, right? They're in school, there's nothing wrong, but they don't show up. How do you handle that? And then you also want to provide an orientation for the parents. Because you're working with minors, you need to have both the consent of the parent, and depending on the age, if you're working with preteens and teenagers, you also need the approval of the child to participate in the group. Both parties have to sign. But you want to provide an orientation to the parents for several reasons. One is so that they know what you want to accomplish, what their child is expected to get out of it. But you also want to reinforce, even before they sign the consent form, that just because they signed their child up doesn't mean they have access to what their child said. And that's going to be very important to tell parents, because, hey, what Johnny and I speak about, you don't have access to. It's protected information. But I'm their parent. I understand. But in order for them to feel safe, they can't have to worry. They shouldn't have to worry about me sharing with you. Otherwise, maybe they won't be honest about, let's say, there are issues that they have with you as a parent. Are they going to bring that forward if I have to report back to you? All right. So you want to know your state laws with regard to working with minors. What I'm talking to you is New York state law. The laws differ from state to state in terms of who signs the consent form, who doesn't, who has access to the information. You definitely want to make sure that. Now, you want to emphasize confidentiality, but there are limits to confidentiality. So you don't want to tell them that everything they say is going to be confidential, because that's not true. In theory, if the school bills the insurance, then the fact that you went to that session, the fact that there is some diagnosis, the insurance company needs to know that. So you can't keep billing related matters confidential. You can't keep court orders confidential. If the judge orders you to appear and talk about something, you have to appear. Kids need to know this. Teenagers need to know this. If there's any form of abuse, neglect, or maltreatment, you're a mandated reporter. Kids need to know that if there's suspected abuse, neglect, or maltreatment, you have to report that to social services. So that's important, right? And abuse comes in three forms: physical, emotional, sexual. Neglect comes in a form of school-based neglect. Let's say the parent's not making sure the kid goes to school, and the kid is just staying home and not going to school for a month on. Well, you have to report that. If you're getting high with your parents, that's reportable. And you get the idea. So kids need to know abuse, neglect, maltreatment. You're a mandated reporter, so you have to report that. If they're suicidal or homicide, you have to breach confidentiality. As it relates to suicidal, I have to care about you even when you think nobody cares about you. I have to love you even when you feel you're unlovable, right? So if you're suicidal, I have to protect you. If you're homicidal, then you're bound by Tarasoff, and each state has their own guidelines with Tarasoff law, the ethics, right? But if someone is suicidal or homicidal, you breach confidentiality. You have to report that both to authorities and if there is a specified target, the target, so that they can protect themselves from harm. Now, so I've listed these things, and you would tell the child these things, and you want to explain to them what is confidential, what's not confidential, because I've listed everything. If it's not any of those things, it remains confidential. Now, you need to get permission from the parent and the child. You need to communicate what your expectation is of those in your group. You want to emphasize confidentiality to the extent. So if you're dealing with a teenager, let's say that the teenager is engaging in risky drug use. Do I report that? Let's say they're buying cocaine. Well, that's illegal, right? But you do not work for law enforcement, right? As long as the parent isn't getting high with the child, then that's not reportable. That stays confidential the same way if you're working with an adult and they were part of, I don't know, the mafia, or they're engaging in tax fraud. You wouldn't share that with anyone. You don't have a responsibility to snitch on them, so to speak. Only if there's an imminent harm to the person themselves or another person. So you want to make sure that they know that they can talk about activities that they're doing that might not be legal, and there's a safety there. And it doesn't go back to the parents, even though they signed the consent forms. Now, we want to think about practical considerations like the size of the group, which we talked about, shrinking it down a little bit. We want to talk about the setting. Some of the limitations of things happening in school is that these are going to be their peers, the same way you're each other's peers at the university. People are learning about one another. So you want to think about how to manage that. You want to remain neutral as much as possible. Do not judge. Use exercises and techniques that will open people up and talk, but remain open-minded and flexible, right? So that's very, very important. And you would be surprised, but people develop strong attachments to you. Even though the group might go for 15 or 16 sessions, they're going to miss the group when the group is over. So you want to prepare people for termination. So if it's a 12-week group, maybe you want to start preparing week 9 or 10. If it's a 15-week group, maybe you'll start week 12, or a 16-week group, maybe week 12. But you're spacing it out so people can adjust with the process of saying goodbye to one another. Now, play therapy. Play therapy as an incredible technique when working with children and adolescents. It's received tremendous popularity. I know when I talked about various theoretical models, I mentioned play therapy and Jacob Moreno and the concept of psychodrama. The nice thing about play therapy is it gives you an opportunity to discuss things in the natural language of the child in a non-threatening way. So I remember with one person I did like a family model where I had figurines of each member of the family. And I asked him to lay out the members of the family in a way that best reflects their experience. And they had, themselves, their mom and their siblings here on one side, and then their dad over here. And what we did was we processed, well, dad was facing the other way and very distant. And we were able to see, well, that's how this young man saw his father. Very distant from the family, disconnected from the family. And then you pay attention to, hey, I noticed that you're very close to mom and your sibling is on the outside. Tell me about that, right? So you can use figurines to understand family dynamics. You could use art therapy, right? So drawing. When you're doing trauma work with children, adolescents, drawing is a nice way to get people to express themselves in a indirect way where you can process that. You can use sand tray therapy or art therapy. All of these things are incredibly useful. Now, if you want a book that's changed the way I view therapy, there is a book called Dibs, In Search of Self, D-I-B-S, In Search of Self. And I don't want, actually, you know what? I don't want to overtell the story, because when you read it, you're going to go in one direction, and by the end of the book, it opens your mind in a different way. But long story short is this a kid who's largely nonverbal, and the parents think that he has some intellectual deficiency or disability. So they take him to therapy, and he's nonverbal and whatnot, and the therapist works with him and cracks the code. So beyond that, I'll encourage you to get the book. I won't ruin it for you. All right. So we talked about different things of play therapy, whether it be drawing, sand tray, figurines, puppet theater, quilting for trauma is good. Now, your group play therapy in the school should focus on interpersonal issues, how to relate with one another in the school, or issues that either are getting in the way of academic performance or things, skills to teach that help with academic performance. But play therapy can work with interpersonal stuff. And it also is valuable to create safety signals for the child. Now, shifting to adolescence. When we think of adolescence, that's from puberty until when you leave the home at early adulthood. So the time frame is anywhere between 11 or 12, roughly, all the way to about 25, right? So that's adolescence. And if we were to think about Erik Erikson says that during adolescence, this is a time period where we're trying to figure out who you are. You're trying to figure out your value system, what's important to you. You're trying to figure out what you want to do, right? What you want to do at the next step. You're trying to figure out relationships, both friendship relationships and romantic relationships. You're trying to figure out who you're attracted to and, how to express your love. You're trying to develop a clique or a friend group, right? All of these things are important. So you tend to have a lot of stress on you in adolescence and emerging adulthood. So you're just trying to figure everything out. Now, very, very common is that there's strong emotional reactions in adolescence, and very common, there's a lot of tension both at home and in school. So if we go to G.S. Hall and Margaret Mead, which were two theorists, they had a debate whether adolescence is a period of calmness or a period of conflict. And what we find is that both of these theorists took the extremes, and it's somewhere in the middle. So Margaret Mead said that teenagers experience, it's the most peaceful time of their life is adolescence. And we know that's not entirely true. And G.S. Hall said it's a period of storm and stress. And we know that he overstated the level of conflict. So we do have conflict, but not at the level of G.S. Hall's argument. All right, so we want to work on family-based conflict and friend-based conflict as part of the the process. Very, very common. Now, one thing that's interesting in adolescence is there is a shift from a focus of the parents having the most authority to your peers having the most influence over you. So there is this shift that happens where seeking approval from your peers matters. You're going to seek their approval more than anything. All right. Now, if you have a group experience that's positive, you're going to discover who you are, what your core values are, what your beliefs are, how you navigate relationships, and how you make decisions. All of these things can happen. Now, we know that in addition to figuring out who you are, we also know that adolescence is a time period where there is this naivete, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's almost like you believe the world is either perfect or should be perfect. And due to the idea of seeing imperfections in the world, you become advocates, right? A lot of social justice experiences emerge from teenagers. For example, March for Our Lives, right? So when we think about March for Our Lives, that is a national movement, but in New York, they were tired of the gun violence. So they did protests, they did rallies, and they met with legislators. And, gun violence is a problem. I think if you turn the news on this week, you would see it, but it's also a problem in the schools. So whether you look at Columbine or Newtown, Connecticut, or Stoneman Douglas in Florida, we have decades after decades of kids shooting other kids killing other kids. And when I say kids, you don't actually have to be a child, but you could be in this adolescent stage. So it's a problem, and because of that, March for Our Lives New York did a whole host of meetings, and they got a law passed called the Emergency Risk Protection Order. And this is a law that is similar to any order of protection, that if a person is at a risk, they have to create distance. There's a stay away plan. But for this, the Emergency Risk Protection Order is about staying away from guns. So a teacher, school counselor, principal can report a person as being a public safety threat, and you can get an order of protection where you remove their guns for a temporary period of time from the household. Now, some of you may not have guns in your household, but if you have guns in your household and a child is talking about shooting up a school, well, then we have to protect the public, and that law got passed. Now, with all orders of protection, they're temporary. So you're not taking away a person's guns forever. You have a certain period of time before the judge where it's a temporary order, and then after the judge rules, there's a certain amount of time that the order is in effect, and it has to be renewed. So in order to maintain the person not to have their guns. So I know that some people are like, oh, that's an infringement on the Second Amendment, but it's a temporary issue due to severe psychological distress that you want to make sure that the person doesn't do something regrettable for themselves or other people. But that comes out of advocating, right? And that is one of the strengths of adolescence. So finding your voice is another characteristic. All right. So when you're leading adolescent groups, you want to make sure that you're clear in your guidelines. You want to make sure that the rules of conduct are clear. You want to make sure that the people who are in your group respect you and accept you. A whole host of techniques can work, such as music, art, drama, humor. All of these things are important. You also want to deal with the biggest issue, which is trust and limits to self-disclosure. So with adolescents, you can oftentimes either overshare and put yourself in vulnerability of being bullied, or you might undershare because you don't trust. So finding that sweet spot is going to be important. And you want to deal with any inauthenticity in the group. Now, cultural sensitivity is going to be very important. You want to demonstrate respect and understanding of people's value system. You want to make sure you understand why a person says what they do. And trying to understand an adolescent does not mean you become one of them. So you don't have to behave in a way that's not dignified to gain their respect. Now, adolescents are going to challenge you. They're going to challenge you more than most groups. In fact, other than a prison population, adolescents are probably going to push you the most. So they're going to test you as a group leader, and they want to know that you're not going to model all the people who hurt them in the world, right? So you're an authority figure, so they're going to challenge authority, but you need to embrace that in a non-judgmental and non-defensive way, and that's going to help you function better. All right. Now, learning the language that people speak is going to be important. And here's an example where kind of like I didn't get it. So, all right. So I remember I was working with a 12-year-old male who had significant issues in his home life and school. And I don't remember what he said, but he said to, because of my reaction, he's like, you're tight. And now, generational gap, I said, thank you. And me saying thank you to him confused the hell out of him. Why am I saying thank you that he referred to me as tight? Well, in the 90s, when we wanted to give a compliment, we would say, oh, those shoes are tight, right? That would be a compliment. But it's used differently today as I got you angry, or you're angry, you're bothered. But I didn't know that. So learning how to speak the language in a way that is received is important. So anyway, I must have been defensive at that point, but also it helped us bond learning that. Now, in the school setting, you're going to deal with issues of metal detectors. You're going to deal with peace officers and law enforcement to reduce the likelihood of aggression and violence. But here's the deal. You can have as many metal detectors as you want. You can have as many peace officers as you want, but that's not going to solve the problem. And in fact, you may hear this language referred to, speaking of other legislation we're working on in New York State, is to address what's referred to as the school to prison pipeline. Some of you may know what this is, some of you may not know what this is. But the school to prison pipeline suggests that how we discipline minority youth actually puts minority youth at greater risk for incarceration. So when we suspend or expel teenagers from school, or we are overly punitive, we run the risk of them finding another outlet for their time. They're more likely to become truant, more likely to engage in criminal activities. So we are working on a law in New York State, as part of New York State Psychological Association, to change how schools deliver discipline. And it's called the equitable discipline law that we're working on, to change it to a more compassionate approach, to a more supportive approach, rather than a punitive approach, because there are way too many minority youth and 20s, 20 to 30 individuals in jail cells. So whatever, we want to change it. So metal detectors and law enforcement presence does not solve the problem. So let's find a way to do that. So doing groups to help people deal with anger management and conflict resolution is going to be much better at addressing the problem. So anger management, conflict resolution, you can run, either one of these can be a group. So everybody gets angry. I've been angry before. I'm sure everybody in this class has been angry. But it's what you do with the hurt you feel. I know I sound like Mr. Rogers right now. It's what you do with the anger you feel that matters. Because anger does not have to turn into aggression. Conflict brings intimacy, but conflict does not have to fuel violence. So in groups targeting anger and conflict, you want to help people develop interpersonal skills to talk things out, to engage in problem-solving behavior, to engage in self-talk, because sometimes you might deal with another person who's equally dysregulated, but they have reckless abandonment. So you might have to talk yourself down